You're listening to the Talking Air Filtration podcast, where you get to know the people that make air filtration possible and help us all breathe easier. Because clean air matters.
We'll get insights from air filtration professionals and learn how they became successful in their careers. Along the way, we will discuss best practices, guidelines, trends, and challenges in air filtration in a variety of applications. We hope HVAC, air filtration, and indoor air quality pros, including business development, engineering, building owners, and facilities management, will enjoy the insights our guests will bring to this podcast. Hi, it's Tony Veroeven, Associate Director of NAFA and host of Talking Air Filtration. We've got a bunch of episodes on the docket to release over the next several weeks, most of which will be some of our conference content since we've gotten back in person. This episode is Dr. Shelly Miller, a professor and environmental engineer from the University of Colorado. As the COVID-19 pandemic moved across the world, scientists like Dr. Miller work around the clock to better understand how the SARS-CoV-2 virus and its variants are transmitted, the details and symptoms and illness, and how to stop the spread of the virus. She presented Helping to Save the World from COVID-19, why an urban air pollution engineer got involved and what she did to make things better, at our technical seminar in April 2022. Listen and you will hear her outline her research into how air filtration can be used in the battle against COVID. Do your customers and colleagues a favor and share this episode with them. Enjoy.
So I want to give you a little summary where we're going today. I'm going to start by explaining to you my expertise and where it came from, why I all of a sudden got called to participate in this pandemic response. I was building my expertise in indoor air quality and infection control for over 20 years. I'm this little known person just working away in a lab, and all of a sudden now it's important. And then I'm going to fast forward to the pandemic and why people like me, an indoor air quality expert and an aerosol scientist, all of a sudden felt the need to start yelling in the forest, hoping somebody would possibly hear us eventually to respond to the pandemic appropriately. Just say thank you and a few closing remarks to round out the talk. And I'll try to make sure I don't go on and on and on. So let's start at the beginning where I started to build expertise in indoor air quality and infection control. I always wanted to be a professor, and now that I am one, I'm not sure what I was thinking, but because I'm about ready to give it up. It's just a lot, right? But I always wanted to be one. And then I grew up in Southern California, and I would go home from school every day because of the air pollution. The ozone levels were too high, and so they would send us home. And then when I got to graduate school, I thought, well, I want to study air pollution. So that's how I started in air pollution. But quickly I realized the indoor environment was really where it was at, right? People are in the environment, building materials. So most of my work has been in the indoor environment. The reason I got into infection control was when I was starting my research, tuberculosis resurged. And this is the quintessential paradigm for an airborne infectious disease. If you're exposed, you have a 10% risk of getting the disease. Well, we eradicated tuberculosis with antibiotics, but then there was the multi-drug resistant strains that started popping up. And we were getting transmissions in a high school in Colorado, a bar in Minneapolis, not to mention all over the world in South Africa and Russia. And we thought, okay, well, drugs aren't working. We got to go back to engineering, got to go back to the basics. What about filtration? What about UV? Which we had been doing before we got drugs, right? So I stepped in and was funded by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to figure out how to use filters and UV lights. And our work resulted in a guidelines published by the CDC for preventing transmission of tuberculosis. Well, that was out in 2005. I read it last year and realized this is exactly what we should be doing for the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's still a relevant document even 20 years ago. But I'll show you just a couple of snippets of what came out of that work. So in 1996, way back when, I published my first paper on filters. It was to look at the effectiveness of portable air cleaners and ceiling-mounted air cleaners on cleaning up an indoor environment that might have bioaerosol in it, which could give you TB and COVID, right? So here's just a diagram of some of the air cleaners that we studied. We looked at 4 portable air cleaners and 3 ceiling-mounted air cleaners, and we put them in our test facility. That's this drawing over here on the right, where they have the air cleaners, and we have where we sampled in our lab, and we have the bioaerosol source, which is a bacteria we're spraying into the atmosphere. And then we look to see how well the air cleaners clean the room. So one of the things I do want to point out was that we looked at the manufacturer-provided airflow rates, and most of the air cleaners were within 20%. This airflow rate is the critical parameter, not to mention the efficacy of the filter itself. But some do tend to not provide the flow rate that is specified when you measure in the lab. So I think this is a critical thing to work on in the industry, is to make sure you're delivering the flow rate you say you are, which most of the time you are, but once in a while it doesn't happen. I want to go back to the filter efficiency because it's so critical. And just to think about these mechanical filters that have a HEPA filter or even a 90% efficient filter in them, they're like your lungs, right? And so the lung efficiency curve on the left is exactly like the mechanical filter efficiency curve. And this dip happens at 0.3 microns, just like for your lungs. So, for example, your lung really isn't that efficient at filtering smoke particles, but it's efficient enough that you still get lung cancer, right, when you breathe environmental tobacco smoke, for example. But this filter efficiency dip happens at 0.3 microns, and for a HEPA filter, it's at 99% plus removal rate. But some filters are much lower. And so when we're looking at this, one of the results we found was, hey, a 99% efficient filter is great, but in a recirculating mode, a 90% efficient filter is just as good when you recirc. Now, when you also do a complete, just a single pass, it has to be a really high filter. But for air cleaners, one of the things that I want to point out that's critical is that the filter removes a particle, whether it's live or dead, whether it has a virus in it or not. I don't know why this is so hard to get the community to understand, right? All of you know it, and our study looked at this as well. So here in this graphic, we show 2 different experiments, a chemical particle and a biological particle. This first 2 bars is just ventilation. It's 6 air changes of ventilation, and compared to the baseline of 2. So we just run the ventilation for 2 air changes, and then we add another 4 air changes of ventilation, or we add 4 air changes of filtration. And here's an extra 8 air changes of filtration. But the bars show us that the chemical and biological removal is the same. And the more air changes you add, the more removal you get in the room. I also wanted to talk just briefly about this next study. Now, this is a lot of information, but what I want to point out is that we tested a bunch of different filters. Here's where we were looking at these alternative technologies. Ionization, HEPA with UV, electrostatic filters. The CDC wanted to know if this newer technology would work for controlling tuberculosis. So that's what was the purpose of this study. And then we also looked to see, hey, can you put a UV light in a room and run an air cleaner? And how does that work together? And basically it just adds up, right? You put an air cleaner in for 6 air changes and a UV light for 10 air changes, you get 16 air changes per hour of air cleaning. So that's one of the outcomes of this study. But the other reason I'm showing you this is there are a couple of key points that came out of this study, which I want to share with you. One is that when we looked at whether the UV lamp was helping to add any additional air cleaning performance in the air cleaner, we found that it wasn't. The filter itself was really what was doing the air cleaning. The thing that the UV lights did was it inactivated any microorganisms that were on the filter. So you just have to ask yourself, is that what you need? Is that what you want? I'm not sure it's that big of a deal. I don't think that's, so a lot of times I recommend people, maybe just get a mechanical filter and you don't need the UV. And we found that no additional air cleaning was provided. I also wanted to point out, the air cleaning, clean air delivery rate is critical. So one of the devices that we tested is no longer being sold. It was very, very expensive and was only able to clean a closet. And that's this one. For example, it was cleaning, this one worked well. It could clean a 30 cubic meter room. This next one did not work well. It could only clean a 4 cubic meter room. And so, knowing what the clean air delivery rate is what we keep trying to tell people when they're buying their air cleaner for performance. So just a little bit about now our work on UV, and then I'll move on to what happened with the pandemic, because this just sets the stage for why all of a sudden I get involved. So germicidal UV has been around since the 1930s. It was really popularized by medical doctors who just wanted to figure out how to keep kids from getting measles in schools and tuberculosis. And so that's what you'll see from this UV work, that the quintessential installation would be an upper room UV where you put lights around the room as just an add-on. And good places for that would be homeless shelters. So I worked with the city of Seattle to implement UV lights in their homeless shelters because they had no ventilation. They had no room for air cleaners, but they had a lot of risk of COVID transmission. So I'll just briefly describe what the critical factors are. You have to make sure the room air is mixing. So if somebody in this room is releasing an infectious aerosol, it has to make it up to the upper part of the room to be inactivated by the UV. So that's one complication. It has to be a well-mixed room. We know that germicidal UV alters the spread of measles in schools, that guinea pigs receiving hospital ward air irradiated with UV did not get TB. They're very susceptible to TB, who knew? It also improves worker symptoms in office buildings. The sick building syndrome symptoms is real. And one study, which I wish we could still follow up on, showed the workers feel better when their air is irradiated in the ventilation duct. This was a ventilation duct study. We can definitely kill airborne microorganisms with UV. We interrupt tuberculosis disease in hospitals. And we can reduce ventilator-associated pneumonia in the NICU, saving babies in the hospitals because of the UV. One thing that came out of our study, this I find to be the most interesting result of our work, was that upper room germicidal UV is very effective, but you have to figure out what you're doing with your ventilation. So I live in Colorado, right? We got to heat the heck out of our indoor spaces when it's January. We always put in the warm air at the ceiling. Well, it stratifies your room so that you have the warm air at the ceiling and there's no magical mixing happening within the room. So when you're doing that, that's what happens here with this low bar. This is the winter conditions. We get no performance of the UV when you're putting in your heated air. What we want to see is 90% effectiveness of the germicidal UV at inactivating the airborne microorganism. So if it's working, the bar goes up to about 90%. But when we put in the hot air at the ceiling, it drops to very low performance. So these kind of performance-related issues are important to know and describe. We also just show that UV and filtration are additive, so you can combine a bunch of different air cleaning technologies. So that sets the stage for why all of a sudden 2 years ago I started participating in the COVID pandemic response, Fast forward 20 years, I'm doing air pollution research, indoor air quality research, and we find out that the pandemic needs aerosol experts like me. Well, at the beginning, I had no idea, right? Here's where we all are. December 2019, wait, what? What's going on in China? There's a severe flu-like illness, and then all of a sudden, remember, they were locking down Wuhan, and everyone was like, what? You can do that? And why are they doing that, right? And this is starting to wake us up, including the scientific community, onto trying to understand what's happening. And then it becomes March 2020. Cases are showing up in New York. I had flown to California, where I think the first case was in March, and I was freaking out, like, here I'm in San Francisco, the first case happened, am I gonna get it? And then they closed CU, which is where I'm a professor, and I can't figure out how this thing is transmitted, right? Then I'm reading and listening to the stories about what's happening in New York, and I see this little thing here. I'm gonna read it to you, because it's very small. It was sort of little. It says, oh, I can't even see it. Sorry. I'll tell you what it says. There was the first case in New York was he thought he was sick, so his neighbor drove him to the hospital, and his neighbor got COVID. Do you remember that? I was like, what? He just drove him to the hospital. Like, he knocked on his door, he said he was feverish, and he drove him to the hospital, and then he got COVID too. And I thought, how the heck could that happen? Because did they touch each other? Did they spit on each other? Did the guy actually drive? Like, because we all thought it was like touch, right? And I thought, this is just bizarre. I was super confused. And then, meanwhile, I'm still doing this. Y'all love this video, right? Like, how do you take care of your groceries and your packages and your takeout food? And so I'm washing everything and trying to figure it all out, right? Just like, I don't know, how many of you were doing all this? Or somebody, no? Oh, good, I'm glad you weren't this crazy. Just thinking, how are you gonna keep your food clean? So then this happens, right? A choir goes ahead with a rehearsal. No COVID in Seattle. No COVID. COVID was in Seattle, but no COVID in this community. And then most of the people rehearsing got this disease. Now, right after this, and about this time, my colleagues started emailing me and calling me and saying, we need you on this team. We need to talk to you about COVID. And I was too busy with trying to teach online, and finally they said, you got to answer your emails. So I answered my emails, and the email came from Dr. Lydia Maraska, who said, we're putting together a team of 36 scientists. We need to tell the WHO that COVID is airborne, and that way they'll tell everybody in the world, and that way we'll all figure out what to do about it. Well, long story short, that didn't happen. We wrote them this email. The current advice from the WHO is to wash your hands and maintain social distance. However, these measures don't adequately protect the population from small virus-carrying particles exhaled by infected people and inhaled by others in non-well-ventilated environments. These particles can travel meters, and this is airborne. And we sent this to the WHO in April. Here's our email to WHO, and here's and then they responded back to us, like basically said, who the hell are you? Like, why are we going to listen to you people? You're aerosol people. So needless to say, we then called for international recognition by signing a petition in July. I'm on vacation, and I'm signing this petition in July, and we start writing papers. These are all our papers about why we think it's airborne. Okay, so this is now July, but meanwhile, still a year later, we're still scrubbing surfaces. So I think one of the things that I'll tell with you later is it's hard for just a scientist at the University of Colorado to get the attention of the WHO, or even though we get like 36 more people from around the world, and then we get like 200 people from around the world, it's just still hard to change science and change minds. But I'm going to just then go through a few of my contributions to try to make this pandemic get over quicker and get people to know what to do to keep themselves healthy and safe. So we looked at the Skagit Valley coral outbreak. All right, we knew this was happening, but how did it happen indoors? And I was on the phone, for example, with the HVAC engineer in the church one day, and we ended up studying this to figure out what happened. So I was on the call with the HVAC engineer and the designer of the ventilation system of the church to understand what was going on physically during the rehearsal. And then we used that information to model the risk and the infection. And so this is the result of some of our work, where we estimate the probability of infection with the air changes per hour provided by the ventilation system or any filtration in the room. And we also looked at how long the rehearsal was. So it's 2.5 hours. That's this solid line, and the risk of infection was 80%. If you can ramp up the ventilation rate or filtration, there was no filtration in this room. If you add filtration or UV, so you get a removal rate of like 10 or 12 air changes per hour, your probability of infection goes from 90 to 30. And that's with a 2.5 hour rehearsal. But with a 30-minute rehearsal, you can get down below 10% risk. So we were talking about all of these different ways to reduce your transmission risk, right? And just briefly, let me show you why you've heard this layering effect. Like, I don't know if you've been hearing it, but to understand, like, to protect an indoor environment, you need to layer the approach, which means air cleaning, ventilation, reduce the number of people, reduce the number of time indoors. And for example here, we'll see that the real event risk was about 90% of getting affected. Well, if you increase the ventilation, you can drop it to 50. If you add air cleaning, you can drop it to another 50. If you add surgical masks, you can do 50. But if you do all of these things together, you can get your risk to 10%. So just one thing will change your risk by about 50%, but if you add them up, you can get a lower risk. So that was my first contribution to the pandemic. Then I just realized I need to also explain this to middle schoolers and high schoolers and elementary students. I had an elementary school daughter and a high school kid. And so I decided to work with a colleague and my daughter to make this video to explain the transmission of COVID. And so this is the video that we made. And I thought it would be fun to show you because you'll see kind of how we were trying to explain it to people back when we were first learning all this. So bear with me. I think you might. Let's talk about transmission of respiratory infectious diseases. Respiratory infections are transmitted between two people when one is infectious and the other susceptible to infection.
When the infected person talks or coughs, they release a mist of particles made out of respiratory fluid that contains the virus. They can throw between 900 and 300,000 liquid particles from their mouth. These particles are less than 1 micron up to hundreds of microns in size. By comparison, the thickness of a human hair is about 100 microns.
One way to get infected is by contact transmission. When you touch a surface that has been contaminated by a virus and then touch your eyes or nose, you can get infected. There is not much evidence at all that this is the way you can get COVID-19.
The second way is when a spray of large particles, like a drop of rain, fly out of the infected person's mouth and land on your eyes, nose, or mouth. To get infected by this route, you must be close up to a person.
The third way you can get infected is by inhaling virus-containing particles that are floating in the air. This transmission route is called airborne or aerosol transmission. Some people think of an aerosol spray can of deodorant when they hear the word aerosol, but really an aerosol is just a bunch of particles suspended in the air.
Getting infected this way could happen by either being close up to a person, called short-range aerosol transmission, or when you're far away from a person, called long-range aerosol transmission. Animal studies, air sampling, and super spreading show that SARS-CoV-2 is transmitted by breathing in aerosols.
SARS-CoV-2 is an overdispersed pathogen like SARS and measles. This means as few as 10% of people transmit 80% of the infections, and many people barely transmit. Most infections happen within households, where 1 or 2 other people may be infected within your own bubble. Also unique to SARS-CoV-2 is that many transmissions are pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic, so you literally have no idea who is infectious. People are most infectious right before they have symptoms of the disease.
To prevent infections, we must control both short-range and long-range airborne transmission. Short-range is when you happen to be in close contact. If you are as close as 8 inches, you can get infected by a spray of large particles landing on your face. Between 8 inches and 6 feet, you will inhale the virus.
Long-range aerosol transmission also happens. This is how super spreading occurs, when you have a series of unfortunate events that happen all at once. A highly infectious person is indoors for a long time, shedding lots of virus, and there are also many susceptible people in the same space. The airborne virus begins to spread through the indoor space and builds up to high levels because there is poor ventilation, minimal surface deposition, and no air cleaning.
Why is this important? Because the way to minimize the risk is with different strategies. You will never prevent short-range aerosol transmission by improving your ventilation. The only way to prevent it is by wearing a good-fitting mask, staying socially distanced from the person, and quarantining upon possible exposure. And definitely when you start to show symptoms. The closer you are to somebody, the more virus you will encounter. So try to stay at least 6 feet apart.
To minimize the risk of long-range aerosol transmission and super spreading, we must treat this with ventilation and air cleaning, and still wear masks to reduce the amount of virus that you breathe in or that you may release. Reduce the number of people indoors so that the chance that somebody is infected goes down.
You cannot ventilate your way out of short-range transmission scenario, but you must ventilate your way out of a long-range aerosol transmission situation. And always use multiple strategies in case if one fails.
So about a year ago, that was pretty useful for kids to teach them what was going on, right? But now it feels really different, right? It's pretty interesting and great that we no longer have to wear masks indoors. And I think we still need to pay attention to indoor air cleaning as well. But I've been living in Spain for the past year for my sabbatical, and we still are wearing masks indoors in Spain. So coming here and then realizing I only have to wear it on the airplane is kind of interesting. All right, forward. So after the video, we decided to try to help the everyday consumer figure out how to buy a portable air cleaner. I can't tell you how many emails I was getting. Which air cleaner should I buy? How do I know which one to buy? I'm like, I can't help all of you with a single email, so let's figure this out. I'm not sure this was the best approach, but this is what we did. We put together a calculator for teaching your neighbor how to figure out what size of an air cleaner to buy to put in their kitchen. And then, because I helped all my neighbors do this, and I'm sure you all helped all of your friends and neighbors figure out this as well, because you're also the experts on filtration, right? So we put this portable air cleaner tool together. Really, it was for schools. We were trying desperately to get schools to implement air cleaners. It was just the quickest, fastest, easiest way to get kids back in schools with air cleaners. And I was personally getting air cleaners into Boulder High and all my kids' schools as well, and having talks with the teachers and the principals to figure this out. So this is really geared for a school, where a school would know what kind of ventilation they might have. Are they a low ventilation school or a high ventilation school? And this is also based on some ASHRAE standards. We would ask what size of the room is, and then they would need to, this would help them understand what clean air delivery rate the unit needed to provide. And so we found this to be useful for a number of schools and a number of people. This is readily available. If you want to access it, please feel free to use it.
Are your air filtration personnel NAFA certified? Ask if they belong to NAFA and have their Certified Air Filter Specialist or NAFA Certified Technician designations. The CAFS and NCT designations are earned after rigorous exams and demonstrate that the air filtration professional has a high degree of knowledge and professionalism. To learn more about NAFA certifications, visit nafahq.org.
And in the middle of all of this, in the summer, I get this call from James Weaver and Mark Speed, and they start by asking me, hey, we've read your articles about aerosol transmission and the coral outbreak. Do you want to help us save music? And I was a little taken aback because that seemed like a big need and a big ask, but I said, sure, tell me more. I'm a musician, and I've played the clarinet before, and I was intrigued by the idea that the pandemic was going to shut down music because nobody knew whether playing instruments was risky. We knew singing was risky, right? Singing obviously was risky from the choral outbreak. So we agreed to participate and lead this study. How many of you have kids in music? Okay, and how many of your kids in music have these little bell covers over their clarinets and trumpets? So that was my fault. I'll show you why that came about. But I'm super glad that kids could still play music and marching bands. Dr. Speed was the band director at Clemson, which has an incredible marching band. These were all the organizations that came together and they donated. Some donated $5,000, some donated $200 to fund the study, and they're worldwide organizations to help this study go forward. We looked at all these instruments, woodwinds, brass, and then a singer and a theater performer to see what kind of aerosol was being released when they were doing their music. And we did the science part, which is a flow characterization of where the aerosol goes, some measurements, and then some modeling. And I'm just going to touch on them briefly just to show you the little bit of the background. So this is one of our singers who was singing with and without a mask. And see, what we look at for here is her singing and what you see coming out of the mouth. We're just interested. This hadn't been done before. You've probably seen some other videos before. So you can see that flow, right, coming out, and we know there's respiratory particles coming out as well. So what we decided to do was look at let's be practical here. We got to get kids in school in August. Let's figure out what to do. Let's put a mask on the end of the instrument because that's probably where all the aerosol is coming from, which is what we did find out. And these blue bars show the aerosol release from an instrument being played, and the orange bars show the aerosol that we measure when you have a mask on it. And you can see at least a 80 to 90% reduction in what's coming out of the instrument. So we just went for it. We said, hey, let's still have music. Let's put masks on the bells. Let's up our ventilation, put air cleaners in the room, and see if we can go forward with music. We've been looking to see if any transmissions happen in a school, and we haven't had any anecdotal reports of a transmission happening because of the instruments being played, which is pretty great. Here's just a picture of the bell cover and some of our measurements. This is a photograph of our modeling study, and the reason I want to show you this is the red and yellow colors show where it's really risky to get infected. And the top bars show somebody singing with no mask, and the bottom bars show somebody singing with a mask. And so I think these kinds of results were what drove, the health organizations to push us to wear masks in the beginning of the pandemic to reduce transmission. And here's a band with the bell covers and all of our recommendations for saving music, which I feel like we might have done. A last couple of things I want to touch on before, I'm happy to answer questions or whatever you guys might want to do. But this study was funded by Carrier Corporation, which is, a major HVAC company supplying HVAC and filtration products. And they were wondering, we're going to be opening up a lot of different public buildings, schools, hotels, retail. Does everyone do the same thing? Like we just do 100% outdoor air and MERV 13? Like is that our approach? And so we said, well, let's figure out if that is the best approach for all these different building types. So we did a study for them using a modeling approach. I'm just going to skip through this, but I wanted to say that the effectiveness of hierarchy of controls is, engineering controls is right in there. It's like the top is, wear mask, administrative controls, but then we need engineers to figure out the ventilation and filtration. So that was what this study was focused on. What do we do with the buildings? Okay, so this building is one room that's like a big open space, right? But some buildings have multiple floors, multiple offices, an elevator shaft, a restroom. What do we do in those kinds of buildings? So, for example, we modeled these buildings. We pretended it was Chicago in the winter, and we looked at what happens when we use MERV filters in the HVAC, air cleaners, and upper room for schools, retail, hotels, and commercial offices. I'll just briefly touch on what an example of a result is. And here's the high school simulation, for example. This is a high school we simulated and what we would do in a high school. Okay, so results in the high school, cafe, no masks. All the kids go into the high school, it's eating time, no masks. What do we do? Well, we would like for the risk of infection, which is the y-axis, to be kept below this dash bar. If it's below the dash bar, only one additional person will get infected besides the other person who's infected. Okay, we don't want it to propagate. So these are all the control strategies we have. We have a MERV 8 filter with a baseline 3 air changes per hour in the ventilation system. That's what's standard in a high school cafeteria, specified by ASHRAE. Well, that doesn't seem great. So if we upgrade to MERV 11, we get a good reduction in risk. And then if we go to MERV 13, we might get a little more. We keep playing with the ventilation and the filtration to get the risk down, but really the only 2 options that get the risk low enough is the UV in the room and a really big air cleaner. Huge. I'm talking, what is this? I don't know. I don't have the CFD here, but it's a really big air cleaner to get that risk down. When we actually then say, well, how about if you all actually put on your masks? Because you can't eat in the cafeteria with a mask on, but we can see. Really, it's still portable air cleaners and UV. So what this study was helping us to understand is a big ventilated space where you're trying to clean the air in the HVAC is difficult, like this room. Smaller spaces is a different kind of approach. But anyways, this is the kind of results that came out of this study. Yeah, it's going to be different for every kind of room. And you got to know what that might work, what might work for your room. And we hope this study will help engineers and practitioners sort out what to do for different building types. And finally, since 2020, a heck of a lot of research has been going on in air cleaning. So I just want to wrap up with what we've learned since since the pandemic. Well, the hot new topic is far UV, so 222 nanometer UV. I think we need to look at this technology. A nice study just came out showing that it's quite effective if they put 5 ceiling lamps in a room and then look at the effectiveness. It's nice. This is an interesting technology because you don't have to stratify the room. You don't have to keep the UV in the upper zone because it has minimal health impacts to the occupants. But it provided a whopping additional 180 equivalent air changes with these UVs, which is astounding. This is a test chamber. We want to see how to do it in a real room. So I think this is an interesting technology to keep your eye out on, is these germicidal 222 lamps and where we can use them. I'd love to see them in restaurants. I'd love to see them in more homeless shelters, for example. We also see this great study out of Spain that showed portable air cleaners reduce airborne SARS, and they really measured the virus, which I thought was cool. They went into a house, they had patients in there that were actually infectious, and they showed with these air cleaners that you could not get transmission of SARS. So I think these kind of studies support the use of portable air cleaners for this pandemic, for example. And this is the data that shows this. If the bar is below this black line, these are PCR results of the air samples. And if your line is below this black line, you have no SARS. So this top, for example, is no air cleaner, air cleaner. No air cleaner, air cleaner. These are the controls. So those are all the controls. So the results showed, hey, I find SARS when there's no air cleaner running, but I don't see it when there's an air cleaner running. I think this is a really brilliant study to look at. And then we've got the DIY air cleaners. I had a student in my class build one and run it in her apartment. Say, hey, build one of these Corsi Rosenthal boxes and see how it works. So she did that. She lives in a small 48 meter squared little apartment, and she did her stir fry for 3 nights, and she measured it with a small low-cost air quality sensor. And it was a great study that she did, and she found, she found, oh darn, I don't know how to get it to go back. There we go. She found about a 92% reduction in her apartment just by running this air cleaner when she was cooking. So we see lots of great effectiveness with this air cleaner. The final hot topic is ionization and electrically, chemically treated air cleaners. And we looked at that early on in the 90s, but we didn't look at the air chemistry and the indoor air impacts. We looked at whether it cleaned particles. And, we found, ESPs definitely clean particles and is a good air cleaning technology. But now we're looking at, does it alter the chemistry? So some of the results I have here is just showing this still is an active area of research. Should we use these electrically treated and ionizers to clean air? We're worried about ozone and gas phase ions reacting with the VOCs to create other oxidized products. This study in a home looked at an ionizer and did find that the ozone was generated with an ionizer on. So I think these kinds of studies raise concern, how are we going to look at this technology? And this study was done by me and my colleagues in chemistry. They have this incredible setup to measure the chemistry of atmospheric air. We did it indoors with an ionizer, and we found that there was no discernible buildup or reduction of particles, so it didn't remove particles or it didn't actually change the chemistry in any way of the room. So it actually really wasn't doing anything. So we're not sure about this technology either. So I think we need work on this technology. Okay, that's the technical stuff. I'd just like to close in summary. I really appreciate your attention for, I guess it's only been 40 minutes, but still I know my students can't sit still for more than 15, 20 minutes, so you've been really awesome. But I like to just close with some concluding remarks. What did I do to make things better? I tried to communicate to the public about what I knew about COVID-19. I published a couple of things in The Conversation, which I think is a really easily accessible version of science. We wrote a paper on how to get this information out into the science. I won the award. We won the award for helping to reopen CU, the University of Colorado. I was on the team to help reopen CU, and we won from our efforts where we had no transmission in classrooms to get CU open that fall of 2020. So that's what this award is. And then I got these nice emails over and over that were so great. Thank you so much, Shelly, for helping me out. I didn't go with the expensive package because I have limited resources. However, I got the UV light in my HVAC and the HEPA filters in my restaurant. This is Salt in Boulder, Colorado, and I went this weekend to have dinner there, and he showed me the air cleaners and the UV and the HVAC and gave me a free appetizer. So it all worked out. So I'm sure you all have those kinds of stories too, where you've helped your neighbor and helped your clients keep their building safe. Closing thoughts on engineering controls, and then my few words of wisdom. So we know what works. Mechanical filtration works, germicidal UV works. Happy to look at new technologies, and if they improve air quality, let's use them. And if they don't, let's just stick with what works. We need to do it in a more energy efficient way. All right, we cannot be burning up carbon to clean our air. So HRVs and ERVs are on the horizon. I think we need to design with the best available control technology. We're not doing that in buildings. I think sometimes we build to the minimum standard in building codes. What can I possibly do that's only in the building code? We should be putting cooking hood, exhaust hoods in every building. Why aren't we? Well, it's not in the building code. So it's the best available control technology, and the pollution in the house comes from cooking. So get a hood in there. So I'm talking about, let's do it to the best available control technology. I know that's the filtration mantra, like, let's put the best in this building. And I think we need to raise the standards on that regard. Portable air cleaners work really well. Let's get them out there, and I know we've been doing a good job doing that. And germicidal UV is underutilized, so how can we improve the usage of this technology? And we have a lot of products for improving air quality. There's the latest and the greatest, but is it really the latest and greatest? Or are we gonna stick with what we know works? Last couple of things that I learned during this pandemic was that you need a team that's multidisciplinary to solve the wicked problems. This was a wicked problem. Global climate change, a wicked problem. Like how to get better indoor air quality into buildings in the US, like a wicked problem. We need a multidisciplinary team to solve this problem. And so I also want us to follow the precautionary principle. Like, there's no danger here, we'll prove it. You know, we don't need to be causing more harm when we are not sure whether this is the right thing to be doing. I also know what it feels like to yell in the forest when nobody's there to listen. So I have this picture of the forest, like, is anyone hearing you when you're yelling in the forest? No, they're not. So you have to figure out how to get more people in the forest to start yelling together. And eventually, I think people will start hearing you. And it's really difficult to surf. I've always wanted to do it. I'm gonna do it my next life. Not happen in this life. But there's lots of waves that came towards us this pandemic. I mean, it was knocking us down left and right. Really crazy times. But all of us learned how to surf, and we made it through mostly to the other side. We're hoping that it's uphill from here, right? So learn how to surf, get back on that surfboard is how I'm feeling. And go through those open doors to keep this progress moving. And like, this is my biggest mantra. I'm gonna end here. Like, you don't know who's gonna help you out in life. So you always try to wanna be kind, because that person may come back and give you a free appetizer when you show up in their restaurant. Sure, I'll help you. And so I'm gonna end there. And I really wanna thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yes, when you mention mask, is that a cloth mask, a surgical mask, or an N95 mask?
So I'll just say, for our masking of the instruments, we recommended to tightly put a surgical mask around the instrument. And those worked really quite well. When I talk about the masking for my study that I mentioned, we simulated a kind of an effective mask, like a 50% effective mask, meaning like it's pretty good, but there's some leakage. Like all of us are wearing masks that kind of leak because they're not fit perfectly, right? So in the simulations that we do like a 50% effective mask, which could be a really well-fitting surgical mask or a really poor-fitting KN95. It just depends. Or a really nice cloth mask. I have all 3 types in my suitcase when I go back to Spain, depending on what I'm needing them for. I hope that answered your question.
Hi, my question is about the virus. If it doesn't become aerosol, if it doesn't attach to a water molecule, can it still become airborne? And are you able to measure that spreading of just the virus itself, not attached to a water droplet?
So in the environment, the aerosol, the virus will be encompassed in a particle that has lots of stuff in it. It's all of the stuff that's in your respiratory system. You won't find a naked virus in the air in the environment or on a surface. Won't happen because the virus is in your lungs, it's in your throat, it's in your nose, and the shearing forces of when you talk shears the liquid off of your throat and it comes out in a liquid particle with a virus in it. It's always going to look like that. And so we can measure the virus, but we'll also measure other things that's in the particle, like some salts and some fats and some, it's just like a gunky mess with a virus in it.
You did the work with the University of Colorado, and what was the key? Who would you contact? How did that happen? Why was it so successful?
To open the university, it was a really cool team of CU scientists and the maintenance operations folks. We have an incredible ventilation engineer at CU. Her name is Shannon Horn, and a great EH&S professional, Tim Lockhart, environmental health and safety. And they work really hand in hand. They called me the summer of 2020 and said, hey, we're trying to figure out how to open the facilities. Do we need to put more of 13s in every building? I mean, I was like, yeah. So, in the absence of data, I felt like that was a good thing to do. So we had a call, and then we pulled together a bunch of scientists. Well, we had a scientist in the biochemistry department who developed a rapid test for SARS. So we could swab all the kids' noses, including my nose, every week to figure out who was sick. We had a team of ventilation and indoor air quality people that I was on. We had a team figuring out how many students can we put in each classroom. And we all worked together, met weekly to sort out what we're going to do for the fall. And it took a pretty heavy lift by all of us because that facilities group had to look at every classroom and every office and every building on the campus and sort out what's the ventilation, what's the HVAC. Oh God, we have no ventilation on this classroom. It's a naturally ventilated classroom. What are we going to do? All of our naturally ventilated classrooms got air cleaners because in Colorado you can't throw open the windows in January, so we run air cleaners. All of our other classrooms sometimes got air cleaners, and sometimes we have pretty high ventilation rates and MERV 13 filters. We don't run 100% outdoor air.
Question here in front. With the, you were talking about
sorry.
yeah, that's okay. You were talking about the building codes and how they talk to a minimum standard. And I was at the AHR Expo and asking those questions of ASHRAE, are they going to be changing those minimum standards to move to best practices? And there was kind of two sides to that answer, but I feel like that is probably one of our next things that we're going to be yelling in the forest about, is how do we get, once this kind of calms down, as people look at their budgets and as people look at how they design new buildings and things like that, is the energy conversation going to trump the, the extra cost of everything else? What's your thoughts on how we are more persuasive of keeping us at that gold standard?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a tough problem, because I think this is a wicked problem because we have competing interests. The best available control technology came about in the Environmental Protection Agency to improve air quality. And when we realized we needed to regulate air quality, we set the standard based on public health. If we don't meet this PM 2.5 standard, people will die, all right? And then we required the industries to use the best available control technology to reduce the emissions to meet these standards. It's a different approach than what we've been doing in buildings, which has been, how do we keep people safe and make sure they get out of the building when there's a fire? I don't know. I don't think there's a lot of stuff in the building code completely related to indoor air quality. How do we keep people healthy and safe in the indoor environments from a public health perspective? So it seems like there needs to be a shift with all of us to be, we need to, that's why I love this White House situation coming in, right? They're focusing on health and air quality in buildings. Maybe that will help us come to the place of what is the standard to meet health in indoor environments, and what's the best available control technology to do that. I think it's a totally different conversation than we've been having in buildings. And it's great that we're going to start having that conversation. We need ASHRAE to have that conversation. They weren't having the conversation when I was part of ASHRAE, so I left because I was so irritated that we couldn't be having these kinds of conversations. It was like, no, I'm not going to say that an unvented combustion appliance doesn't need venting. No, I'm not going to say that. I don't know. That's a minimum building code problem, I think. So I really welcome partnering with all of you to get to that place, because I think it will be better for your industry and better for public health.
So one of the questions that we get a lot is, can we test for SARS inside of the building? And, can we show that whether it's filtration or UV, that what you've done has actually reduced the concentration? And I was hoping you could explain a little bit about why that's difficult to do.
Oh, it's very difficult to measure SARS, and it's dangerous. It's not something that we need to be doing. That request is ridiculous. My study in 1996 showed that a particle is a particle. If it's a 1 micron particle, and a filter will remove it. And it doesn't matter if there's a virus in it or not. And I think there's a lot of science that shows that, and that's why we need aerosol scientists to also be explaining this. And I think we just have to rely on the science and just say, no, we don't need to do that. I mean, I don't know, sometimes obviously people don't listen, but you don't need to measure SARS. Now, to test for UV effectiveness, you do need to see if it inactivates a organism. The organism does not have to be SARS virus. It can be a surrogate virus. Our work on tuberculosis, we never use TB. We always use a surrogate. And that's fine, because you can find organisms that behave similarly and use those.
Just as a quick follow-up, and I 100% agree. But there's, like, we had a hospital ask us recently, they said, well, they're testing and they're finding SARS in sewage treatment plants. So that's kind of a predictor of what's going on. And they were asking, can't we test for it in the air? So we would have another predictor in a hospital of what's going on. And I told them, well, no, it's super difficult to do. And it's, like you said, it's unsafe. But that's kind of the driving force behind this. People want to predict what's happening, and I just don't think it's possible.
It's very difficult to measure SARS in the air. It's been done in a number of studies, but these are the best viral aerobiologists in the world who can do it. They have the right equipment and the right labs. If a hospital wants to spend that kind of money to do it, I do have colleagues who are working on rapid tests to eventually get there, but it's still in development. Like the rapid test for COVID that we use, we could try. We're working on tests to do the air, but it's not there yet. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. As engineering controls are adjusted to increase the ventilation rate as recommended, how are the portable air cleaners affected for their efficiencies in those situations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a bit of a trade-off, right? So this is, let's see, one way to look at it is when the CDC wanted us to improve the ventilation in a hospital room to treat tuberculosis, they said, we want 12 air changes per hour in this room to treat tuberculosis. Well, the HVAC was only providing 6. So then to get to 12, you had to add 6 air changes of air cleaning, whether it was a portable air cleaner or UV. So then they add up, right? We have 6 ventilation, 6 air cleaners, 6 UV. The problem and it's straightforward like that, you can just add it up. But what happens is when you have a really high ventilated room, like it's 10 air changes per hour, and then you add the air cleaner, like it adds cleaning, but it doesn't look as effective because you're already doing a good job with the ventilation. And you can add the air cleaner, and it will add a little bit of boost to your air cleaning, but you're already doing a good job, which isn't to say don't add the air cleaner. But you see the power of air cleaning when you're in a room that has poor ventilation and you add an air cleaner. You have 2 air changes per hour and you add your 8 air changes per hour of air cleaning. You get huge benefits. But if you already have 10 air changes per hour of ventilation and you add another air changes, the room is clean. You don't need to go that high in almost every situation to protect public health. We are trying to get, we're trying to figure out what is the best ventilation rate or cleaning rate for public health. Well, it depends on what you're using the space for. So I would say let's all try to get we were telling schools, try to get to 6 air changes per hour, right? And if your ventilation is at 2, you got to add 4 of air cleaning. But hey, if you're at 6, you're fine. You don't need to add another 6 air changes of air cleaning because then you're at 12, and that's like a hospital room. You don't really need that for what your room is being used for. It's subtle, and that's why every case is different, and I'm hoping that's a little bit of helpful of how I think about it with your question. It's a really good question. Five more minutes, yeah? Okay, or maybe we all need a break. I guess there's one in the back.
Did anyone from the WHO end up contacting you after they came to the same conclusion you did a year or so ago?
So in a roundabout way, they invited some of our group to be on their ventilation task force, which then developed ventilation guidelines, which then they sort of snuck out there and said, and here's some ventilation guidelines. And we're like, the reason you're having ventilation guidelines is because it's airborne, but you don't want to tell anyone it's airborne. But you want us to help you work on your ventilation guidelines. So no, kind of, they didn't acknowledge that what we were saying was important, but they wanted our help to develop ventilation guidelines. And then about a year later, there's this subtle shift in messaging about it being airborne, as well as the CDC, it being airborne. I think it's very, very difficult politically to explain that you were wrong. And that's okay. I don't know. Don't you think that's complicated, right? It's just complicated. Like, no, we didn't need to be washing surfaces. We needed to be cleaning our air. It's a complicated problem. So no, it's not been very well. We're talking about writing a paper explaining the whole thing because I think it's a really interesting story. So we'll see where that goes. One more. So it's a really interesting story behind that, and we ended up working with a medical anthropologist to understand this unthreading of why it was so difficult to shift paradigm in that it's surface to airborne. Very, very difficult. And it's a really interesting story, but just briefly, we used to think that all disease was airborne, like way back in the 1800s. And then we realized, well, cholera is not airborne. It's spread by contaminated water. Okay, well then, somehow it got shifted to think everything is water and surface. And we forgot about the airborne part. And then we started teaching our physicians and our medical community the science of aerosol incorrectly, and that infectious diseases were all surface and you needed to wash your hands. We started fighting with the infectious disease community about 10 years ago, trying to get them to understand that flu could be airborne. It's not always airborne, but it is airborne a lot of the time. And so we were working on that problem, but it hadn't resolved itself either. And so then when the pandemic hit, we were still stuck in the it's all surface, and because airborne it's just a crazy idea. And only 3 diseases are spread airborne: measles, tuberculosis, and chickenpox. That's it. Well, but we were saying, well, no, there's flu and sometimes cold, and So I think it was just the education and the paradigms that had been taught for centuries that kind of got stuck. I think being more nimble with the science is where we need to go. All right, well, thanks again for all of your attention and interest.
Thanks for listening to the Talking Air Filtration podcast, a production of the National Air Filtration Association. Clean air matters.